You're listening to the Reinvest Podcast, where each Tuesday we show business owners and entrepreneurs how to reclaim, reconnect, and refocus their life by bringing you the top real estate professionals in the industry. We'll help you diversify into real estate by equipping you with the tools and tactics to build generational wealth. Your hosts, Garrett Gatton and Seth Simonillo. Hey guys, we have the benefit and the privilege to be in the studio in person for episode 99 of the Reinvest Podcast. Very excited for today's episode here.
99, that's a big number.
It is a big number, and it's actually the number preceding episode 100. Shameless
Nice.
plug. You're going to want to listen to next week's episode. We've got a really big guest coming on. And we've got a big guest today, too. So, Andrew, I'm not trying to downplay you.
Not offended.
He was trying to give you a backhanded compliment.
Yeah, that's true. We've got coffee. We're good to go. We're going to talk some real estate today. Before we jump in with our guest, I want to throw out kind of a challenge to you as a listener. At Level 5 Capital, our slogan, our mission is very simple yet profound, and that's we invest in people. We're real estate investors, and a lot of the time that's where the focus of what we do goes. But really behind the real estate are, at the end of the day, the most important asset involved in what we do, which is people. And there's a lot of facets to that, and words matter. So when we talk about at Level 5 Capital, we invest in people, how does that even show itself? Well, one cool thing that happened last week or 2 weeks ago is at one of our properties, our ownership team was passing out pizzas to some of the residents just as a way to get face-to-face with people. The way that we treat our properties, we put value into the properties, not just from a return on investment perspective, but in a way that's going to meaningfully improve our residents and our tenants' lives. So I think the challenge behind that is as you're, building your real estate investment portfolio, building wealth, not to lose sight of the fact that people are the most important thing to what we do. Without people, we couldn't have these businesses, we couldn't own these assets, and you need to take care of that. So take that for what it's worth. Yeah,
Good word.
You got to be reminded of that a lot. I have to remind myself. So, okay, we're going to jump in today. So joined with us in the studio is Andrew Yates, who is, I don't want to say that you're a native. I don't make that assumption. Are you a native of Findlay?
I'm just a couple minutes south of Findlay, so I'll say that I'm native. I moved there right after high school.
Okay, awesome. So you're just north on I-75, a Midwest, Northwest Ohio investor, 37 years old. You own Yates Management and a pretty extensive private portfolio of real estate. So let's just jump in. Give us the origin story. Who is the man, the myth, and the legend, Andrew Yates?
All right. So I started out, I would say, interested in business and in real estate. When I was probably 14, 15, my older sister at the time had dated a guy that started getting into real estate. So I started working on his properties for free labor.
How much older was this guy?
He was 20-something.
Okay.
And so I started working on his properties, again, free labor. My father owned a plumbing and heating company, so I grew up in the trades.
Gotcha.
So wasn't intimidated by the work itself. So at that point, I read, like most, I don't want to say most, a lot of people our age. I read book Rich Dad Poor Dad. My dad had recommended it. I read it, and I would say that's really what started that journey. So,
which is actually pretty interesting because, to your credit, you have to have a pretty good head on your shoulders to be 14, 15 years old and pay attention to some of that that's happening. I can tell. I don't even know what happened when I was 14 and 15 years old. I can tell you I wasn't thinking about real estate.
Sure. So, yeah, actually, I think I might have been 15 when I read it. And at that point, I knew what I wanted to do. But the path to get there was a little unclear. So at that point, I think that was the best thing that could have happened because the only thing I could do was educate myself. So I read probably dozens of books. At that point, I was eager to get my license. Not so much for the freedom, but
your real estate license.
No, actually, driver's license.
Yeah, because you're 15.
Yeah, so I remember asking my dad to drive me around, look at the duplexes, triplexes. Yeah. And by the time I was 16 and got my license, I was probably not the best thing to do, but I would call realtors and set up showings. And I was
as a 16-year-old.
Yeah, I was 16, but I probably looked like I was 13. So I remember looking at several. They never asked questions, but
were these realtors like vetting you? Like, hey, do you have any money, kid?
Some asked.
Is your dad showing up to look at this later?
No,
this is for me.
I don't even know that he knew that I was doing it. So I'd drive around, look at properties, run the numbers. summers. At that point, that was just a practice because there's not a lot I could do. So in the meantime, again, I'm in high school working, working for my dad in the summers, saving up money. I was always relatively frugal with money, and especially once I became interested in real estate, I was anticipating using this. So I think that's also what might have helped with some discipline from that standpoint.
Did you have a goal of what you were trying to save up to, knowing that you were going to be a buyer in the market?
I don't recall us trying to get a certain amount. I just knew that I wanted enough for a down payment. So I had fortunately saved that up. And by the time I was a senior, I had bought a duplex, and my dad,
baller.
As a senior.
Yeah. So my dad had to co-sign for the first loan.
Right.
I bought a duplex, and then so I was obviously playing sports as well. So I would go there and work a little bit or mow come that spring. That summer after I graduated, I had put quite a bit of money, or elbow grease, we'll say, some money, mainly elbow grease into it.
Equity.
Rented both sides out for more, and then refinanced it at that point. So
I just want to pause real quick because I would have loved to have been your friend and been like, hey man, let's go hang out, let's go to the bowling alley this Friday. And you'd be like, hey, sorry, I've got a tenant right now that's calling me. And I wouldn't have had that concept for even what you were talking about.
Yeah, that's actually a good thought. So I remember I knew I would have to make sacrifices. Once I bought that I was very focused on making this work. And I remember that summer after we graduated, a lot of my friends before going off to college were all having fun, taking trips. And I didn't partake in a lot of that just because I needed committed. So committed first, and then I worked evenings. That summer I worked a lot on the property.
Kudos to your dad. It sounds like he must have been supportive if he was willing to co-sign on a loan with you.
Yeah. Maybe that was a little bit of a gamble. He knew how serious I took it. Yeah. So I think in worst case scenario, he could have been a backstop, but in my mind that wasn't an option.
Because that's pretty cool that he cultivated that within you. Even to allow you to buy a duplex before you've graduated. I feel like when I was looking at buying my first investment property, my dad said, this is either going to be really good for you or it's going to ruin your financial life. That was quite literally how he put it. And I was like, okay, that's a little weird to say that.
Yeah, but at the same point, I think some people allow themselves a back door. And when you do that, you're not fully committed. So for me,
you got to burn the ships.
Yeah. Even I remember, all right, so keep in mind, it was a duplex. One side was vacant, which I rehabbed that side first. And then the other person moved out before I got the first one rented. So I remember laying in bed at night. It was probably 3 weeks until I got it all. Both sides probably rented at that point. But I remember stressing every night because, I couldn't sustain that for a long period of time.
Right.
So
let's talk about that for a second. Was that a wise thing to subject yourself to that kind of stress and forced pressure? You really threw yourself into a difficult situation.
Yeah, I think you can do as much due diligence as you want to, but sometimes there's a balance. There's a lot of people that have paralysis by analysis and never take action. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then there's the other where you shoot from the hip your entire career, and there will be a point that bites you. So
that's called gambling.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So for me, I think the fact that I had read enough to have some knowledge helped me take that step. But yeah, you're sometimes it has to be baptism by fire. And
the thing about education is it is free, and there's a reluctance to want to start there because it doesn't feel actionable. But you really do have to put your dues in there.
Yeah.
And I think there's a spectrum. Some people are able to, jump into the deep end and maybe have more pieces in place than what they would give themselves credit to. Some people are so green, they're learning business as a means to buy real estate.
Sure.
You already had some of that exposure.
Yeah, and my dad also, again, he owned a plumbing heating company. So just from a business standpoint, I think the entrepreneurship was never even hardly specifically discussed, but that was just the default. That's what I expected to do. Yeah. So, and for me, the path made most sense via real estate. So I remember even sitting down with my dad before I bought that first property. I'm like, look, I know where I want to go. I don't know the stepping stones to get there, but I'll figure them out. So that was the one thing I just was, I guess, ambitious enough to just take that step.
And he didn't own real estate?
No, he had a business. He had the business or the
commercial
real estate
property.
that his business was running out of. But no, he didn't actually.
So you were kind of pioneering. He wasn't able to necessarily help you in that he had already been in that seat.
Yeah.
He was just supportive.
However, I had to do HVAC to the property, so I got a pretty good price on that initially. So can't complain with that.
So what happened after that? You bought your first duplex, and did that give you a taste of I'm doing the right thing?
Yeah. So in the meantime, so I worked for my dad at his company. I was going to college for business, and then doing the real estate. So there's a season where I'm working or probably sleeping a couple hours a night just to do all that.
Wow.
But I refinanced that first property, and then keep in mind, this is 2005. So at this point, the market's inflated, but a few foreclosures are trickling in. Mm-hmm. So I bought a property for pennies on the dollar compared to what it was worth. I mean, put carpet in it, painted it, did a little bit of rehab, and flipped it, and then did well on that one, and flipped another one, and flipped another one. So
what did doing well mean then compared to now?
At the time, so I probably made anywhere from 35 to 55,000 on each one. And as an 18-year-old, I mean, that was a good start.
At an 18-year-old, you feel rich.
As an 18-year-old, you just made as much money as some people make in a salary position for a full-time job.
I remember literally being almost 19, having had a duplex, having flipped a handful, and being confused, like, why doesn't everybody do this? This doesn't even make sense. So at that point, keep in mind, this is 2005 going to 2006, and now the foreclosures are, the world's starting to change a little bit. So that at that point, I have a duplex, which is cash flowing a little bit, but to me, it was good. And then I have some liquidity to work with. Now, when all of a sudden these duplexes, triplexes are coming in, that's when I shifted gears to, rather than flipping so much, because I was a little antsy about trying to flip in that market.
Right.
So I began to just use the liquidity to buy up duplexes, triplexes. So I would buy them, rehab them if needed, get the rents up, and then finance them. So I was able to, for several years, they're basically leveraged, but not over leveraged. And
you were buying cash, rehabbing cash, burying it.
Correct, exactly. And that was before I knew that term existed. It was another 10, 15 years before I even learned what that was. So yeah, I was able to continue to grow, increase cash flow, increase equity without over leveraging. Yeah. So at that point, I also understood, like, this is, I don't want to say once in a lifetime opportunity, but it was a nice shot in the arm to be able to really get started. So I went as fast as I could. Yeah. Again, at the time, unmarried. Like, if I'm going to take a risk and crash and burn,
it's now.
And if you're 20 years old, you can make it out.
You can do that, right?
Yeah.
I did not understand that at the time, and I wasn't even really looking to take those kind of risks. You don't know what you don't know. But now I look back and I'm like, oh man, the stakes are way higher now.
Sure.
For me, with the responsibility level. The only thing I'm banking on now is the fact that I'm healthy and energetic. You know what I mean? But
yeah, you're still young.
That's kind of magnified. Yeah,
you're just a pup.
Yeah,
you know
but it's the kids. It's like the family aspect is what
definitely changes the dynamic.
You don't want to bet the farm on 6 kids.
But there's a sweet spot, though, what you're talking about, where you're eager and energetic, and you have the tenacity, and nobody's really counting on you except for yourself.
Sure,
that you can put the pedal down and make some stuff happen. So okay, you were buying. You actually saw kind of during that time in the market how unique that was, and it's crazy what one property can do that you do right, let alone replicating that and getting 5, 10. How many properties were you able to acquire during that time period?
I think ultimately at one point I was buying maybe 8, 10 a year. But it was a progression where I was increasing it. So that was in like late teens into the early 20s. I was buying quite a few properties, and then I would
self-managing,
and I would flip some,
yeah.
But there were others that just made more sense to cash flow. So I would just continue to build a little bit of a scattered portfolio, and then at some point, obviously, as rents went up, some of those made more sense to liquidate and leverage into a larger deal.
And were all those just in Findlay?
So I started out in Findlay. I then actually had a friend who owned property in Florida. So I actually, in 2000, it might have been, I was 24. I bought a condo actually in Florida that had the entire development basically went belly up through this.
Wow.
There were 600 and some units, and 400 and some basically were foreclosed. So I will mention this. Yeah, at the time, the property is only a couple years old. I bought a beautiful condo, 3-bedroom, 2.5 bath, beautiful facility. It had lazy river restaurants in it and everything, and bought it for $72,000. And it had previously sold for $350,000. So yeah, so that was both a good investment and a personal purchase. The thought was in the future when I got married and had kids, we could obviously enjoy that.
Did you hang on to it?
So I hung on to it for several years. Again, I was dating, but I wasn't married at the time. And then fast forward, once I got married, my wife and I would visit it pretty regularly.
Which, what a good card to pull out of your back pocket when
by
you're
the way.
dating. You're like, hey, you want to go on a date? I've got this condo down in Florida.
And I would go down with some friends or whatever. So I did very much enjoy it, but it got to the point where it certainly didn't get it back up to 350. But after owning it for several years, some of the equity had come back, and it made more sense from a business standpoint to sell it than to hang on to it. So it was positive cash flow, but just north of break even.
And part of this, and I don't know if this is what the metric that you were talking about or looking at when making that decision to sell, but return on equity.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right?
So,
and that's something, explain that a little bit, because I think it's something a lot of investors don't understand.
Yeah. So I actually analyze that at least once a year on all my properties. So basically, over time, as you're paying down debt, your equity is increasing. Most likely, as cash flow increases, the value is going to go up, so on and so forth. So let's say over the course of 10 years, you own a property that you started out with 40,000 equity, and now it's 110. The question is could you take that 110, leverage it into something else where you can get a better return on the equity you have? So with that particular property, again, it was a personal purchase that I could justify because it was a good investment. But after fast forwarding, a couple of years, some of the equity had come back. Still didn't buy it really for cash flow, but I didn't want to lose money. But there came a point where I was looking to do another larger deal, and I was going to need to free up some cash. So I actually sold a couple properties and 1031 that into some land. So yeah, that's what I ended up doing with that because it did have a decent amount of equity.
When you start owning assets, you're able to use all of the levers of real estate in your favor. I've been on the buying side of things for the last 5 years, and just really in the last year was able to build some equity. And, you buy in 2018, right before the market rises, you see, because when you're talking about equity building, it's principal pay down, and then it's also appreciation. So you're seeing both of those things, which happened a lot in the last 5 years. So now we're at the point of that feeling of I own the asset, I have equity. Now how do I get to use that equity? Well, I could sell it and move into another property. I could borrow against it in the form of a line of credit. I could refinance it in long-term debt. So you started to you had that portfolio built up, and now you can use those pieces to manipulate and move on to what's next.
Yeah. So again, as I mentioned, I was buying single-family homes, duplexes, triplexes, some fourplexes, and I had equity in those. But again, inefficient to manage. They're sprinkled over town, and actually, I had some in 2 or 3 other small communities around Findlay. But it made more sense to sell those off, take that equity and roll it into one deal where the management process is more efficient, preferably newer.
Because now time was a concern to you.
Yeah. And the other factor was, again, at the time I owned maybe 40 units, and I'm managing them. And I'm also, I'm wearing all hats. So that being the case, I knew that if I was going to get to where I wanted to go, I needed to have people working for me so I don't have to manage the day-to-day. So that was kind of I got to a point where it's kind of go big or go home. And that's when, keeping in mind, up to this point, I actually started to build some houses, sell some homes that way. So again, although I was already in construction, I became a little more familiar with new construction. And then at that point, I decided to develop an apartment complex. That being said,
Which is a big jump.
Yeah, it was a big jump.
I thought you were going to say buy an apartment complex. No.
So I had paid for a market study personally, and our city had also paid independently for something else, and it was obvious there was tremendous demand and in the higher price range. In fact, of those duplexes, triplexes, single-family homes, I had some single-family homes I originally intended to flip, and all of a sudden someone's reaching out to me, hey, are you willing to rent that for $2,200? Are you willing to rent that for $2,500? And at the time, I didn't. That was foreign to me. So
by being a local investor, you had a pulse on the changes in the rental market.
Exactly. And I had also visited friends in other cities in college that they lived in really nice apartment complexes. And in the city that I lived in or still live in, there just weren't a lot of options. And since 2005, I think that literally might have been the last new construction, and it just stopped for like most areas.
Right. There was a gap there. So
that being the case, I saw demand that didn't exist and wanted to try to fulfill that. So I began the process of doing due diligence, and that was a year's worth of due diligence to begin.
Let's talk about the due diligence aspect of it. You mentioned earlier the shooting from the hip or the paralysis by analysis. A lot of people would say, I live in this market, I understand this market, and it would give them confidence to, pursue doing something like that. What prompted you to pay for the market study, especially if there was already some resources out there?
Yeah, I knew the size of the deal I wanted to do, and because of that, it was worth the money. And in general, I'm pretty detail oriented. So that being the case, that's something I don't always want to get in the weeds. And as I've grown, I want to manage people. I don't want to get in as much of the details. However, that's my natural inclination. So that being the case, I would rather just do tremendous, thorough due diligence. But that being the case, I don't want to hold me back from actually taking action. So I did a lot of research first. I felt very comfortable and confident to proceed because of that, which had I not done that, I would not have felt comfortable to move forward.
So this is where things get a little saucy, because I remember when we were talking over coffee, like probably a couple months ago, normally in a development, there's different layers to this of roles. Okay. You have the developer, who usually is the owner, and they're putting their financial, livelihood on the line. Sign on. They're the owner. They have the most to lose and the most to gain. And then you have the general contractor, who is the working on behalf of the developer to go actually build whatever the asset or the product is. And then you have all the subs. What roles did you choose to fill in this scenario?
So to take just a tiny step back, so I had originally planned on having it developed. So I reached out to a company. They gave me, quote, great company to work with, but they obviously have to make a profit. And it was at the time $2 million that was earmarked for that. So the way I looked at it was my thought process, in hindsight, I don't know that I would suggest this to other people. In order to do this and maintain as much equity as possible, I was going to break it into phases, do it myself, get it financed. I theoretically would be able to create some equity and then proceed to the next one, which is what I ultimately did. And basically cut out a general contractor to do that. And because I had some familiarity with construction, I don't want to say I felt comfortable. I felt that I was capable.
You'd build some single-family houses and have confidence. Yeah.
And if I ran into challenges, that's one thing that when I run into challenges, I do feel in general I'm able to just figure things out.
Yeah.
And that's where you want to do as much research as possible, but there comes a point where you just have to have confidence in yourself to, again, your back's against the wall and you make it work.
So how many units were in phase one if you did it in phases?
First phase, I think, was 37. I don't remember the other two numbers for the other two phases, but in totality, 92 units, but they're more of a class A.
Yeah.
So they were more high end for.
Yeah, we've driven back there. They're really nice.
Yeah. So that was another thing. In the city, there's not many options as far as amenities. So I decided to do a clubhouse, has fitness center, game room, indoor, outdoor lounge, that kind of thing, because again, that was what I was hearing from people. That doesn't exist. There aren't many options like that.
Which I would really, kudos to you, tip the hat, because just because you get a market study doesn't all of a sudden make you feel super confident that you can fill these units and rent them out at a premium.
Yeah, so I remember specifically doing that, and this is another thing. Hindsight, looking back, I don't know that I would suggest doing this. I set the new basically market rent as the highest in Findlay at the time. Again, having done the due diligence, looking at the numbers, with the household incomes for a demand far exceeding what I was going to build, it justified rents at the time of like $1,500 or $1,600, which again, going back, 8 years at this point. That was pretty high. So I was several $100s a month higher than anything. But got the first building of the first phase done, leased them up, got the next phase done, leased them up relatively quickly.
Wow.
So I just remember, I will say, once you commit and then all of a sudden you hear some people thinking you're crazy, like I've done my research, but we'll see if it works.
Yeah.
It worked out, but yeah, there were a lot of people that thought I was pushing rents too much, and it wasn't.
How long did it take you to complete all three phases of that development?
I think like 2.5 years, because that's another disadvantage to doing it all yourself, multiple phases, is it's going to take a lot longer to do the entire process versus if you brought in an investor, you can just either knock it all out in one or maybe two phases. And if you had a general contractor, it might have gone quicker. But the trade-off was I was able to maintain as much equity as possible.
Right.
Well, because a general contractor is typically going to charge you 15 to 20% as their margin in the deal. Mm-hmm. And so you are able to retain that 15 to 20% so that when you go into refi to do phase two, you essentially took that and was able to roll that into doing the next phase.
Yep, and then into phase three.
And talk about like maybe one of the things we had written down off camera here was, it's easy for people from the outside looking in, maybe there are other local investors, there are other, stakeholders in the community. They see your success, they see where you're at, but they don't see where you've been.
Sure.
Talk about some of the difficult times throughout your journey getting to the point where you completed that development that maybe most people, they gloss over.
Yeah. So between phase 1 actually went relatively well. Going into phase 2, I had worked with a company to finance the second phase. And as part of that, there were terms that I was anticipating getting and a closing date. Now, I was 29 at the time, being probably overly aggressive, I decided closing date was supposed to be I forget the date, but it was a certain date.
Yeah.
And I didn't want construction to get delayed. So I tried to coordinate construction to begin right after that, thinking close and everything will work out perfectly.
Right.
What could happen?
Yeah,
wrong?
exactly. So the closing got delayed, and I had to make a decision whether I was going to pull the trigger on $700,000 worth of purchase orders for material, so on and so forth.
Out of your own pocket.
Yeah, and get general contractors going. And I made the unwise decision at the time to do that. Closing kept getting delayed, and then the terms were changing. And this particular company that I'm working with at the time, doesn't matter. But anyways, I decided this is not a route I want to go. So at this point, I'm in a bad spot.
You've just committed to move forward with that, and you don't have your financing lined up.
Correct. Yeah. So that was where that added a tremendous amount of stress. But
you're writing the letters IOU on like
the one thing I will say is, again, at this point, I'm not necessarily behind with payments on anyone yet, but I'm communicating with people like, hey, it might be coming in a little bit late. So communicating with people, and then I did work with a local bank and got it financed. But that was, again, that would be just simply lack of wisdom on my part at the time, being overly aggressive.
Yeah. Which in reality, I mean, looking back, if you would do it again, you would just put a pause on the start of that second phase until you knew you had your financing.
Yeah. So since then I've had situations like that, and I have proceeded, but it's because I had the liquidity to just cover it regardless. Right. But I wouldn't put myself in a position where
you didn't have a plan B.
I didn't have a plan. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. Since then, I talked to a gentleman at the time, and just got some wisdom from him. And any project that he would do, he at minimum would have plan A, B, and C. And at any moment he could pivot. And if this goes wrong, he's prepared to go on B. Maybe it's less lucrative, but you know what? He's not going to jeopardize what he's built.
Yeah.
So as I look at every deal moving forward, no matter what it is, I have B and C always in place.
And just to kind of communicate what a plan B or C could be, is you still had equity in other properties. Correct. That if you needed to, you could have gone to the bank and maybe bundled those, tapped into that equity, strategically. To get something going until,
So then that's exactly what I did in that scenario. I was able to tap into some equity. I came up with a good chunk of it. I did get a minority of investor in there, and was able to proceed. But in the future, or currently, and then also in the future, it's just having a couple other options. For example, if you built some condos or something like that, maybe having bylaws in place that match if you had to turn this into multifamily. And lease them. The point is that if something goes wrong, how are you gonna monetize it? What are you gonna do to get out of it?
That's one of the things that we saw in 2021, 2022, as prices just were skyrocketing on multifamily properties. A lot of people were underwriting deals for them to have to be leased out as short-term or mid-term rentals to drive the NOI and the income.
Never a good idea.
And you're just like, man, if this could not be converted into a long-term rental scenario, then it probably isn't a good deal. And that just made me really nervous. But that's an example of somebody putting themselves in, this has to work this way, and if not, the alternative is not good.
Yeah.
And usually there were investors involved with that.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up. So as I underwrote the deal, and then as I put the budget together for construction, I spent an incredible amount of time crossing T's and dotting I's. And that's the one thing that I would say saved me. I was very conservative, both from a budgeting standpoint and the pro forma. I exceeded the pro forma net operating income, and on the budget, even with some of these hiccups, I still came in almost exactly at budget. And for
which is a win.
That is a win. For the scale of the project, that was
pretty incredible.
Yeah, and I would almost say obsessively, as change orders came in, it would update projections so that if in real time, if things change, you can make adjustments. But if you're not paying attention, it could sink you pretty quickly.
When you're talking about, well, it's kind of that term multipliers, right? When you have a project of that complexity, there's so many multipliers, something that if it changes, it's going to change 3 or 4 things, and the numbers can get away from you really quick.
Yeah, exactly. And so, for example, I remember giving performance to the bank or whatever, and as I'm moving forward with construction, if construction gets delayed, not only has construction costs changed, but that completely throws out your performa. If you're, I remember ones that faced specifically didn't get them leased by the fall. Well, construction was delayed a couple months, but then trying to lease up a phase in November, December, January, February.
Right. Lost
months.
So
that really changed things. So I would be very cognizant of that as I move forward and take all that into account as I was building.
Let's talk about how you started out, you were 18 years old, bought a duplex, and then over this time, you're actively getting involved, you're getting reps in, you're trying your hand at different things, you tackle the development. As you've had time to reflect over the last, what would that be, almost 20 years of being an investor?
19 years.
How have you seen yourself evolve or change in your mindset, not just as an investor, but as an individual?
Yeah, so when I first started out, it was the getting to the point where the cash flow allowed freedom, autonomy. That was kind of the goal, and also at the time for my future family, so that I could have time with my family. My dad, again, owned a business. He worked very hard, but he had the freedom to spend with us.
Right.
So that was, I think, just subconsciously, like, again, a default setting. That's what I wanted to do, and that's what attracted me to real estate. So as I continued to, I guess, be very involved in every aspect, I knew that I didn't want to manage properties, do everything. So that was when I made the decision I wanted to develop a place. So at that point, once it was fully developed, fully leased, I at that point hired a staff. They work for me, and I don't deal with as much of the day-to-day. I do obviously work with them regularly, but it allows me to have the time to look at investments, so on and so forth.
Yeah, and your comfort level too, to be able to tackle. You exercise that risk muscle. And what's funny is simultaneously you feel more empowered to take larger risk, but you also know how to take wise risk.
Yeah.
Because you're like, I'm not going to put myself in a financial bind. So if I'm going to do this next time, I'm going to have, and that's, again, when you're looking from the outside in, you're like, man, these people are taking big risks. Well, don't just assume that someone is just taking big risks for the sake of, I hear I should take risks in order to become wealthy.
Not at all.
There is kind of a bottom line revenue aspect of that where they've learned those lessons.
And you've already built the financial base.
Yeah. If something goes
Cash
wrong.
flow base,
absorb.
equity base.
Yeah.
You can, if something went wrong, you could, at this point, take it, depending on what that is, of course. But yeah. So, okay, let's jump into our smaller pockets segment. So, Andrew, go ahead and tell us about a deal that went wrong. It could have been back when you were buying single families or flipping or maybe even something with the development. But what went wrong in the deal, kind of what happened, what was the outcome, and then most importantly, what did you learn from it so our guests and our audience can avoid the same mistakes?
Sure. So actually, I had flipped at the time up until a couple of years ago, maybe 55, 65 houses. I actually had never lost money on a deal. However, so that's where I would bet on 10 properties and only probably get 1 or 2 just because I'd be very thorough and careful. However, there was one property that it was a single family, not a single family home, single story, and it had a large footprint. And at the time it was maybe January when I'm looking at 6 inches of snow on the roof. I go through, it looks like it's in relatively good condition. And so I buy the property. As soon as I close in it, it warms up a little bit and the entire roof is completely curled, and there was damage up in there, some mold that I just kind of overlooked. And again, maybe not the worst horror story you've heard, but that pretty much wiped out
any profit.
Yeah, it was a huge roof. So, and the margin on that one was relatively thin. So I just remember that being a little lesson to be even more careful because I thought I was. So it doesn't matter how careful you are. A pandemic could happen. There's different things that can happen that you have to be prepared to withstand.
I'm not fishing at all, and if the answer is no, it's fine. But did you get really comfortable, going through some of these properties, and that kind of rocked you to sleep a little bit?
Yeah, so I would say you can become complacent when you haven't had situations where you've lost money. And then as I started to hire some people that would do some of this for me, I might not, I'll say, invest in them enough, just making some assumptions that they know how to do what I've done and have experience doing. So the ones that I managed, I've never lost money on. However, as I've continued to grow, I've had some other people involved, and there have been some situations where we're at break even or maybe a little bit of a loss. But again, the other thing is when you get comfortable, you can become lazy, and it doesn't really hurt you. Yeah. It's not a good habit to get in, but I can see how that can happen.
Rock you to sleep.
My wife and I were talking about this last night with our kids, the need to allow your kid to feel the discomfort of failure. And so many times as a parent, your instinct is to want to bail them out right at the last second so they don't have to experience that pain. But there's something that happens in your brain when you are allowed to feel the consequence of a haphazard decision that you made, or lack of planning or a spur of the moment thing. And you just have to sit in that discomfort because it literally rewires your brain so that your brain says, don't let this happen again. And that's going to help build success moving forward because you're going to have to make that decision probably dozens of times moving in the future.
And it also refines you in business. So as you continue if things get challenging, so the past 5 years in real estate, there's been a lot of opportunity with some inflation, values are going up. But prior to that, for many years, there was less. You didn't have some of those advantages, certainly to the degree that we've had. That being the case, you really had to be very careful, when you're underwriting deals and not make assumptions that rents are going to go up by 10% a year because it just wasn't happening. So I think going through each time there's a different cycle, things get more challenging. I think for an investor who can persevere through it, that's the best thing for you long term.
Which Anthony Vicino, he's an investor that we had on the podcast a while ago, and just on his social media channels, I've been kind of following him, and he's made this statement several times that the only difference between you and that person that you look at that's super successful is they're standing on top of a bigger pile of failures. They have had the reps in, they have lost, they have learned, and then because of that, they've persevered. To your point, if you're able to push through those hard times, you're gonna grow. And so I think it's important. People fail one time or a couple times and they get discouraged and they want to give up. But it's really just a game of perseverance.
I also think, too, there are so many avenues in real estate you can make money, whether it's short-term rentals, whether it's, there's so many different ways you can go. And now versus 20 years ago, you can educate yourself for free, learn everything. And I think it's both an advantage and a disadvantage. If you educate yourself, stay focused, and persevere through the difficulties, an advantage. But a lot of people, I think, as soon as things get difficult, they look for an easier path. And that sustained over a period of time isn't necessarily going to lead to success.
Well, if you think about the whole principle of investing, it's compound interest. And in order to experience that, you have to stay invested in whatever that is. And that is also your time staying in the same thing long enough to see that happen.
I don't know if this is true, but I saw this quote this morning that it was, if you spend 18 minutes a day on a skill, and that accumulates to 100 hours a year on a skill, it says, at the end of that year, you'll be in the top 10% of people that are doing that skill. And then that's kind of like a really broad assumption and a broad statement. And then the point under that was consistency is key. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I was like, wow. 18 minutes a day on something. I think we all kind of hear that with instruments and various things. But just that compound effect of getting 1% better every day and what that's going to do over the course of a year in your life.
We've dished out a lot of really good stuff, but now we're going to go into what we call our little nugget. So, Andrew, this is the part of our show where you're going to give our listeners, it could be very practical, could be a hack, could be a principle that is at the core of your business that whoever's listening, they can apply to their real estate investing businesses.
Sure. So, again, I don't want to sound like a broken horse, but I think it's identifying what avenue you want to go down, educate yourself thoroughly, preferably before taking too much action. And as you pursue that, as things get difficult, obviously try to persevere through them. Another thing too that was very helpful is just trying to identify successful people that have done what you're trying to do, and expedite the process of which not only you can become successful, but you can hopefully avoid some of their mistakes. So I did when I was younger, in addition to reading books and whatnot, I did find some mentors and people that had success in that, and that for sure helped me avoid some things that I might have done, and or help me with some different ideas. There's whether it's from a tax standpoint, whether it's a strategy, you can continue to learn, and that's actually one thing that I found very enjoyable in the real estate game is
There's always something new.
Exactly. After several years of doing this, you'll learn something that you question yourself. How did it take this long for me to
Yeah,
learn?
I know. You're like,
and so
but
that's also what makes it fun. Obviously, we're doing this to make a living, but it can be a lot of fun in the process.
It is a game of kind of like just pushing yourself, learning new things. So it's fair to say that over the years, who you've needed as a mentor has evolved.
Sure.
As whatever that next kind of sector was. It might be like, well, I'm at the point now where I have some assets and I didn't like that tax bill I got last year.
Sure.
So I need to find someone who understands that realm of things.
Yeah.
And it's always developing. It's always kind of growing.
So what's the next step for you as we're kind of getting to the end here? But where are you looking to go as a real estate investor? Are you looking to develop more? Or?
So right now with cost of construction, interest rates, so actually the past couple of years, ever since the interest rates had started escalating, I was already in the process of looking at 2 or 3 new construction deals. As I underwrote those over the course of time, they're getting worse and worse, predominantly because of the interest rates and some of the costs. So I actually walked away from some of those and pursued a smaller deal that I've since almost completed here in a couple of weeks. But I think there might be more opportunity with existing properties.
Mm-hmm.
So for the near future, probably won't focus on new construction. I'm not saying I wouldn't entertain something, but I think it might make more sense to buy existing. And in the particular city that I live in, it's not a huge city. So although I am looking there, beginning to start to look elsewhere as well.
What's been one of the best resources in your business development?
Resources in the sense that like education, or
Could be a really strategic partnership with a bank. It could be a mentor. It could be a mastermind group. Something that's really catapulted you forward, have been instrumental.
Yeah, so rather than one specific one, I think there's just a lot of different ones along the way. So for example, when I told you I started building houses, I didn't go all on my own on the houses. So I had some friends from high school that we partnered on that. So I funded the deals. They were in construction. So they did the construction, I funded the deals, we partnered up, built some houses. That helped me. I already understood construction, but I had not developed anything at that point. So after doing that for a while, it was a benefit to both of us. We made money. They were able to get in some properties that maybe they couldn't have. And then for myself, I was able to learn the construction process. So rather than one specific thing, it's been a journey of trying to just continue to educate myself and work with people or learn from people that, again, have had success in those areas. So some of those are books. Some of those I've taken classes, courses, all kinds of different things, some of which may not have been as beneficial, but I absolutely do not view it as a waste. I'm not encouraging anyone to go frivolously join groups if they're not committed, but you gain a little bit of knowledge. Mm-hmm. There's been a couple where I spent a lot of money to be part of this real estate club. I learned 1 or 2 things that probably saved me tens of thousands. Other ones made me hundreds of thousands. And was it worth that cost up front? Some people think you're crazy. Right. Once you gain that knowledge, you've got that moving forward.
I think the one thing to know if you're listening to this, as you explore the possibility of partnering with other people, working with other people, the beautiful part about real estate is oftentimes you're able to test that partnership or work with somebody, and it can be a variety of capacities. That doesn't mean that you are a 50-50 owner of an LLC and you have tethered yourself to that person. There's different ways to structure something that would allow you to collaborate but still mitigate your risk, retain upside, different things like that. So just know that if you're listening, don't just assume you need to go start an LLC with somebody 50%, but you can still collaborate. What does it look like for people to follow your success, kind of learn more about what you've done or who you are?
So not necessarily looking to specifically plug anything, but I mean, if you want to find me on LinkedIn, you're welcome to do that. And then again, on our website, I just have our properties that I own on there.
Awesome, man. Well, dude, thank you so much for taking time to explain this. And, you have nothing to gain from this episode other than just encouraging other people who are on their investment journey. And I think that attitude of wanting to kind of give back that way is awesome. So
if I could add one additional thing for the listeners, when I first started out 15 years old, reading the benefits of owning real estate, I can say, although I'm not young anymore, I've been in real estate long enough, nearly 2 decades, that getting to a point where you have that positive cash flow, and it is for the most part passive, it really can change your life and your family's lives. And it also can allow you to to give and to be generous with that. So once you have the time, because you're not working every day in a W-2 job, you can kind of take a step back, analyze what's important in life, and it really does create a quality of life and allows you to steward those resources how God may have you do that.
Awesome. Yeah. I couldn't say it better. Well, thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
As always, excited that you joined us for another episode of the Reinvest Podcast. Stay tuned every Tuesday for new episodes. And if you want to learn how you can use your hard-earned capital to diversify into real estate, go to our website, lv5capital.com, and shoot us a message. Move farther, reach higher, and grow deeper. We'll see you next time.